Alright, so I want to start out with a scenario today. After a long, hard day at work or at school, I know I need some comfort food. Now, one of my favorite comfort foods is chocolate chip cookies. Alright, you go in the kitchen, open up the fridge, grab the dough, plop it down on a pan, put it in the oven. Now, after about 10 or 11 minutes, you hear that timer sounding from the kitchen. And I have to tell you, when I hear that timer, my mouth starts to water because the anticipation of just how darn good that chocolate chip cookie is going to taste. Now, hopefully, you all are experiencing the same things. Some salivation is happening just by the talk of chocolate chip cookies, because that is the topic of today's discussion. Drool, salivation. Well, more so classical conditioning. Now, with classical conditioning, we cannot talk about, or we can't leave out, Ivan Pavlov. Now, Pavlov was a Russian biologist. His dad didn't really want him to go the science route. Instead, he wanted him to go the religious route and become an Orthodox priest, but Ivan decided to take the different route. Now, what he studied was that of the digestive system of dogs, and something pretty annoying happened to Pavlov that basically allowed him to come up and become extremely famous. In his study with the digestive system of dogs, what happened was he noticed that the dogs would start to salivate when they just heard the footsteps of people approaching with what could possibly be the food. They started to salivate at the sight of their food dish. All right, they started to salivate at just the mere sight of food. And like I said, that was pretty annoying to his experiments at that point in time, but he's like, hold on, there's something more important going on here. There's an important type of learning, and that is what Pavlov started to research further on. Now, this is exactly how his experiment was conducted. Basically, he would have a dog isolated in a room. It was also harnessed so it wouldn't get up and run around. And another thing is that they actually had these little tubes inserted into the glands where the dogs would salivate. So it wasn't necessarily the nicest thing for the dog. Now, what would happen before conditioning is you would have this scenario. And this makes sense. All right, you have the food, which is the unconditioned stimulus, and when you show the food to a dog, the unconditioned response would be salivation. I'm very similar to this, okay? If you show me a big batch of chocolate chip cookies, I'm immediately going to start to drool. This makes sense. It's a reflex, okay? Now, what he wanted to do in this experiment is he wanted the dog to respond to a different stimulus. And his stimulus of choice was a tuning fork. If you don't know what it is, go look it up. Now, with this tuning fork, when you strike it, it makes noise. It makes a sound. He struck it. It was a neutral stimulus at this time because it didn't elicit a response. When he struck it, it made noise. The dog's response was nothing. Okay, that makes sense. It's a neutral stimulus. Now, moving on with his experiment, during the conditioning, what he wanted to happen was he wanted the dog to elicit a response to this tuning fork. So, the best way to do that would be to prepare something that elicits a response with something that doesn't elicit a response. So, he would have the food, he would show it to the dog, and also at the same time, he would strike the tuning fork. Because the food is already there, it's going to go ahead and bring about the unconditioned response of the salivation. This is just added on extra. So this is the conditioning part. Following this, after conditioning, his goal and what he achieved was when he struck the tuning fork, the dog would salivate. So now our tuning fork is no longer a neutral stimulus because we're eliciting a response. We have conditioned stimulus, and we now have a conditioned response with the drool. Now, this is groundbreaking, all right? Pavlov, as well as his research team, were able to publish, get this, 532 papers on drooling dogs, and that's of classical conditioning. But yet that is a lot of drool. Now, the thing is, he couldn't just focus on this same old thing over and over. He actually dedicated the last 30 years of his life to this. He had to move forward and move further into the study to understand it a little bit more. One one focus was that of acquisition. When was the initial learning? When did the dog link things together? When did he pair the food and the tuning fork? All right. When did he understand that the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus basically would bring about food? Now, another thing would be the extinction. This is when your unconditioned stimulus is not followed by a conditioned stimulus. Think about this. If you have this scenario over and over and over, this is after your conditioning. You keep on striking the tuning fork and there is no presentation of food. Over time, what's going to happen is the dog's going to stop salivating. He's going to stop responding to that. So that is the extinction. Now, spontaneous recovery. If Pavlov allowed several hours to pass, all right, without striking his tuning fork at all, basically the dog would be nice and relaxed, and then say, I don't know, 3 hours later, he decides to get out the old tuning fork and strike it. When he does that, what do you think the dog started to do again? Yeah, he started to drool. So that is that spontaneous recovery. Another thing that he researched about was that of generalization. This is pretty fun, simply because you have two things that are very similar. The dog will respond, will start salivating to the tuning fork, but also he might start salivating to something that sounds very similar to a tuning fork, say like a bell. Discrimination. This is when the dog is very smart. He's distinguishing between different sounds. That dog will start to salivate at the sound of the tuning fork, but if someone was to bang a drum, bang a gong, something like that, he's not going to respond to it. All right, so that's discrimination. And another thing that we can talk about is the higher order conditioning. Now, in this case, let's assume that Pavlov did a second round of conditioning. When we think of higher order conditioning, we got to think of like conditioning on top of conditioning. This is crazy stuff. Now, he conditioned the dog to salivate at the sound of the tuning fork. We know this, but let's assume that Pavlov just wanted to have a little bit more fun, and he was going to snap his fingers, then strike the tuning fork, and then see if the dog would salivate to that. We know the dog's going to salivate when he hears the tuning fork, so adding the fingers, basically, that's just the second round of conditioning. Over time, if they continue this, even just the snap of the finger would elicit a response, the conditioned response, and that would be salivation. All right, people, hope you guys learned a lot.